Another thing people looked at in terms of the desistance process is whether or not men and women desist differently. So whether or not there are gender differences in the desistance process. Even though we know that in terms of the amount of people we're talking about, obviously there are a lot more men who have the opportunity to desist because there are more men who are committing crime, but we still want to know if there's anything about being a man or being a woman in our society that might make the desistance process change. And again, Peggy Giordano is someone who has done some work on this. And really, one thing she found is in terms of the reasons that men and women give for why they desist, the reasons actually show a lot of similarities. So she calls these things that men and women bring up in interviews and surveys about desistance, she calls them common hooks. What are some of the common hooks that people talk about in their description of their desistance process? So again, for men and women, she notes that a lot of people talk about the prison experience, going to prison, as being something that caused them to want to desist. A lot of people again talk about religion, talk about turning to religion, finding a new religion, becoming more religious as being an important part of their process. Even though we know from the research that one doesn't necessarily always lead to an actual change, it's the perception that these people talked about that was interesting here. And a lot of them talk about family. A lot of them talk about wanting to desist to be a better father, to be a better spouse. So the idea that children and marriage are a big factor of desistance isn't something that just shows up for women or just shows up for men. Both genders tend to talk about it as being an important part of their change. She also pointed out that there are cognitive transformations that are important in the desistance process. And when those things are involved, she finds that when people are open to actually going through a cognitive change, a transformation, those are the people that are more successful. People who are actually honestly open to change, admitting they have a problem, admitting that what they've done is wrong in the past, and really wanting to change and having a desire to be a new person, to change the way that you are living your life. She really talks about that as not being exclusive to one gender, but being an incredibly important part of most people who are able to be successful. So there are some similarities here in the desistance process, but there are other people who have pointed out that there actually are some gender differences. Even though men and women tend to describe the same things as mattering to them, other people who have looked at the difference in desistance processes between men and women have found some interesting differences. So, in particular, some research by Chris Uggan and a colleague have looked at the fact that, in terms of the actual numbers, women tend to be better at desisting. They tend to be more successful at remaining crime-free for longer. And one of the reasons that they talk about for why that might be the case is the fact that tends to be a big difference between women who are exiting prison in terms of how prepared they are for society. Women tend to enter prison having been more educated than male prisoners. And while in prison, women tend to be more likely to participate in education programs. So they not only did they enter prison a little bit more equipped, but they tend to get more equipped while they're there. Women in general who are exiting prison also just tend to be a little bit older than your typical male prisoner. In the last class, we talked about the fact that the average age for exiting prison is about 25. Well, for women, it's closer to 30. And one argument from Uggan and Critchen is they might just be more mature, they might have more adult responsibilities facing them leaving prison than your typical male. And women seem to be more optimistic in terms of their prospects and ability to maybe get a job in the future. So when men leave prison, probably because of the deficits they know they have, they tend to be a little bit more pessimistic about their ability to get and maintain a legitimate job. Women tend to be more dedicated to and invested and positive about their likelihood of getting a job. One thing they do note, though, is that not all women who are in prison are created equal. And one big problem with women's ability to be successful in the desistance process is the addition of having addiction to illegal drugs. Women with drug use are much less able to desist from crime because a lot of them talk about most of their criminal activity being either directly related to or, somehow a part of their process of getting and maintaining a drug habit. From kind of a rational choice perspective, some recent research that's been done about desistance has to do with a person's feared self. So this is research that was done fairly recently by Ray Paternoster and Sean Bushway. And again, these are two people who are approaching criminal behavior from a rational choice perspective. They believe that what's really important in the criminal process is the decision making, is what goes into your decision to commit crime. And for them, they really think of the desistance process not really as being so much about these larger level social bonding learning experiences, but they think of the desistance process as being a very individualistic cognitive process that people go through. Some people are better able to do it than others. That what's most important, according to Paternoster and Bushway, is the person that one sees themselves as, their kind of working self, and what they see themselves being in the future. So according to them, offenders, well, really everybody, but for this purpose we're talking about offenders, offenders have a working self. They have a working image of themselves that has to do with their preferences, their social networks. All of those things are consistent with the working self that they see themselves as being. We also all have a future possible self, somebody that we see ourselves being in multiple years. You know, the idea being, if I were to ask you all, how do you see yourself in 10 years? You would have some kind of a vision in your head. Well, according to them, criminals, offenders have that too. And your desires for what you hope to become make up your future possible self. Well, according to them, when offenders whose working selves involve criminal activity, you know, criminal networks, criminal preferences, when they start to see that future self as being a problem, it becomes their feared self. So their feared self is anxiety over what they're going to become given their current habits. So according to them, you have to have this, or else you won't desist. You have to actually have anxiety and fear about what your current practices are going to lead to in the future. If you don't have much care for this feared self, this feared future self that your current decisions are leading you towards, you're not going to want to change. You have to want to change that future self away from being a feared self to being a positive future self. So, you know, and again, this might sound a little heady, a little difficult to understand, but you know, the essential idea here actually makes a lot of sense, because it's all about a person's actual ability to want to change. And according to them, that's really the most important part. More important than your spouse, your job. What's most important, according to them, is you deciding that the costs of your present self, that the costs of what you're currently doing and working with, outweigh your benefits for the future. If you decide that, if you come to that crystallization, if you come to that realization in your life, that is what's going to help you be successful in the desistance process. Okay, so that's all for today. Next time on Thursday, we're going to talk about crime prevention and do kind of a broad overview looking at things that we have figured out that are ineffective, that are effective, and things that we just don't know whether they're effective or not. So we'll talk about that next class. Your reading for next class is on Blackboard. It's an article by Larry Sherman, and make sure you have that prepared before you come to class. I will see you Thursday.